The humidity of the San Francisco night hung heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Kenji Sato stood at the edge of the sidewalk, his boots soaking up the cold rainwater that pooled near the curb. He adjusted the strap of his weathered leather messenger bag, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders from a 14-hour workday. His gray hoodie was damp, clinging to his frame, and his eyes were bloodshot from staring at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred into static. He looked like a man who had lost a fight with the city and was just trying to find his way home, but tonight, home wasn't where he was going. He looked up at the towering facade of the Gilded Lotus, where the golden neon sign hummed with a low, electric vibration that seemed to vibrate right through his chest. As he stepped toward the velvet rope, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air here didn't smell like rain, it smelled like status. Julian Vane stood behind the podium like a king guarding a fortress, his charcoal suit pressed to a razor edge and his hair slicked back so tightly it looked painted on. He was mid-laugh, leaning in to whisper something to a group of women draped in silk, but his expression soured the moment his gaze landed on Kenji. It wasn't just a look of annoyance, it was a look of deep-seated, practiced disgust. Julian stepped forward, not to greet him, but to block the path, his arm extending like a barrier to a crime scene. He didn't even look Kenji in the eye, instead letting his gaze travel slowly from Kenji's scuffed sneakers up to his damp hood. "The service entrance is in the alley, pal," Julian said, his voice dripping with a casual, polished cruelty. He didn't raise his voice, which made it worse. It was the tone of a man talking to a stray dog that had wandered onto a private lawn. Kenji stopped, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen spider-webbed with cracks, and displayed a digital invitation. He told Julian that he was there for a 9 p.m. meeting in the VIP lounge. The manager didn't even glance at the screen. He just chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that caught the attention of Tiffany Reed, who was standing nearby adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. Tiffany stepped closer, her heels clicking like a metronome on the marble. She pulled out her latest iPhone, the camera lens pointed directly at Kenji's face, and a smug, predatory grin spread across her lips. She asked the heir if the club had started a charity program for the homeless that she hadn't heard about. She laughed, telling her followers on the livestream to look at the clueless tourist, trying to crash the most exclusive party in the city. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on Kenji's lungs, but he didn't flinch. He tried to explain again, mentioning the name of the holding company on the invite, but Julian had heard enough. In one swift, aggressive motion, Julian swiped the phone out of Kenji's hand. He held it between two fingers as if it were covered in filth before tossing it casually toward the gutter. The device hit the asphalt with a sickening crack. Julian leaned in close, the smell of his expensive mints masking the stench of his arrogance, and told Kenji to scuttle back to whatever slum he crawled out of before he had him hauled away in crates. He told him that people of his kind didn't belong in a place built for excellence. The crowd around them erupted in a chorus of cruel snickers, a wall of high society noise that made Kenji feel smaller than he ever had in his life. He stood there, drenched and silent, watching the rain wash over his broken phone, while the heavy brass doors of the club swung shut, leaving him in the dark. The cold rain on Kenji's face felt different now, it felt like the rain from 15 years ago. As he stood shivering on the pavement outside the club, the neon lights of the city blurred and transformed into the flickering street lamps of his childhood. He could almost hear the sound of a heavy sewing machine hitting the sidewalk with a metallic crash. In his mind, he was a teenager again, standing in front of his father's humble tailor shop. His father, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with chalk and pricked by needles, was pleading with a man who looked exactly like an older version of Julian. That man was Arthur Vane. Arthur hadn't been wearing a tuxedo then, but his cruelty was just as polished. He had stood there with a clipboard, his eyes cold and transactional, as he informed them that their lease had been terminated to make way for a luxury development. Kenji remembered the way his father's voice had trembled, not out of fear, but out of a desperate need to protect his family. He had tried to explain that his youngest daughter, Hannah, was upstairs in bed with a fever that wouldn't break, and that moving her into the damp night air would be a death sentence. But Arthur Vane didn't care about fevers or families, he only cared about square footage. He had watched with a smirk as a young, teenage Julian, already a carbon copy of his father's arrogance, kicked a basket of silk spools into the gutter, laughing as the vibrant threads unspooled into the mud. Kenji's father had knelt in the dirt, his dignity bruised but not broken, and looked Kenji directly in the eyes. He spoke in a low, urgent Japanese that Kenji would never forget, telling him that a man is only truly homeless when he lets others own his spirit. He told him to never build his house on another man's land, to work until he owned the very ground beneath the feet of those who tried to kick him. The memory shifted to the years of grinding poverty that followed. Kenji remembered the hollow ache in his stomach as he shared a single bowl of rice with Hana in a windowless studio apartment. He remembered the smell of old paper in the public libraries where he spent his nights, teaching himself the language of high finance and the complexities of venture capital while his peers were at prom. Every cent he earned was a brick in a wall he was building against the world. He had worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors in buildings he would one day buy, and wearing the same threadbare hoodie so that every extra dollar could go into a secret investment fund. He had watched Hannah struggle through her illness, the weight of their medical bills nearly crushing them, but he never let her see him cry. He had channeled every ounce of his humiliation and every drop of his sweat into a singular, burning purpose. Returning to the present, Kenji looked up at the Lotus logo glowing above the club entrance. It was the same stylized flower that had been on the letterhead of the eviction notice that ruined his father. The irony was a bitter pill, but it was one he had prepared to swallow for a decade. He walked toward the gutter where Julian had tossed his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. His fingers brushed against the cracked glass as he picked it up. The screen flickered to life, the light reflecting in his dark, determined eyes. He wasn't the trembling boy on the sidewalk anymore. He was the ghost of a debt that was finally coming due. He didn't look at the club with anger, he looked at it with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He pressed a few buttons on the damaged screen, bypass the glitches until he reached his encrypted messaging app. He saw a message from Sarah, his chief of staff, confirming that the final signatures had been secured. The Vane Empire was bleeding out, and Kenji held the only tourniquet. He typed a single sentence back to her, telling her to execute the buyout of the parent company immediately and to ensure every deed was in his name by midnight. As he tucked the phone back into his pocket, he felt a strange sense of peace. The storm was still raging around him, but for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't afraid of getting wet. He was the one who owned the rain now. The silence following the destruction of Kenji's phone didn't last long. Julian wasn't content with just a dismissal, he wanted a spectacle. He pulled his own sleek, titanium-cased phone from his pocket, his thumb dancing across the screen with a practiced, elitist flair. He looked at the crowd of onlookers, his voice rising to a theatrical pitch as he announced that a suspicious, homeless individual was harassing the guests of the Gilded Lotus. He spoke into the line with a sickeningly sweet tone of feigned concern, describing Kenji as a vagrant who appeared to be under the influence and potentially dangerous. Beside him, Tiffany Reed leaned against the velvet rope, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She checked her gold watch, sighing loudly as if Kenji's very presence was an exhausting inconvenience to her schedule. She told Julian to hurry it up because the stench of failure was starting to ruin her expensive cocktail. Across the street, parked in the shadows of a closed-down department store, a silver sedan sat idling. Inside, Sarah, Kenji's chief of staff, gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She watched through the rain-streaked windshield, her phone mounted to the dashboard recording every second of the interaction in high definition. She was the silent witness, the guardian of the truth that would eventually set the city on fire. She wanted to rush out, to scream at Julian that the man he was treating like trash was the person who signed her massive bonuses, but she remembered Kenji's strict orders. This had to play out. The world needed to see Julian's true face before Kenji tore the mask off. The tension escalated when Julian stepped off the curb, invading Kenji's personal space. He began a loud, public rant, projecting his voice so everyone in the VIP line could hear. He told Kenji that people like him were a cancer to the aesthetic of a world-class city, a blemish on the beautiful skyline they worked so hard to curate. He promised Kenji that he would make it his personal mission to ensure Kenji never found so much as a dishwashing job in this town again. As he spoke, Tiffany reached into her designer clutch, her movements sly and calculated. While the crowd was distracted by Julian's shouting, she bumped into Kenji, a feigned stumble that allowed her to slip her heavy, diamond-encrusted bracelet deep into the side pocket of his damp hoodie. The blue and red lights of a patrol car soon cut through the neon haze, reflecting off the wet pavement in dizzying patterns. 2 officers stepped out, the gravel crunching under their boots. One of them, a veteran with a hardened face, immediately mirrored Julian's aggression, placing his hand on his holster as he barked at Kenji to keep his hands where they could see them. The younger officer, Miller, looked less certain. He glanced from Kenji's calm, stoic face to Julian's frantic, entitled pointing, sensing a disconnect between the dangerous vagrant report and the man standing before him. Julian didn't give them a chance to think. He shouted that Kenji had just robbed a guest, pointing a trembling finger at Tiffany. Tiffany let out a well-rehearsed gasp, clutching her wrist and crying out that her heirloom bracelet was gone. She pointed at Kenji's pocket, her voice trembling with a fake, high-pitched terror as she begged the officers to get her jewelry back from the thief. The older officer didn't hesitate. He grabbed Kenji by the arm, spinning him around and slamming him against the cold, wet hood of the patrol car. Kenji felt the metal bite into his chest, the freezing rain dripping off his nose onto the police cruiser. He didn't struggle. He didn't even speak. He just watched Julian, who was now leaning back against the club entrance, a smug, victorious smirk playing on his lips. As Officer Miller reached into Kenji's pocket and pulled out the shimmering diamond bracelet, a roar of approval went up from the wealthy crowd. They laughed and cheered as if they were watching a hit Broadway show. The handcuffs ratcheted shut around Kenji's wrists with a series of sharp, mechanical clicks. Just before he was ducked into the cramped, dark back seat of the car, Kenji turned his head slightly. He locked eyes with Julian, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that barely carried over the wind. He told Julian that he should have checked the lease on the building before he decided to call the cops. The door slammed shut, cutting off the world and leaving Kenji in the silent, dark heart of the storm he had created. The heavy door of the patrol car closed with a muffled thud, sealing Kenji into a world of plastic upholstery and the rhythmic click of the turn signal. Outside the window, the world was a frantic blur of neon and rain, but inside his own mind, the chaos had stopped. He watched through the reinforced glass as Julian Vane shared a high five with a group of club promoters, their laughter visible even if it was silenced by the car's frame. To the world watching on social media, Kenji Sato was currently a headline in the making, a fallen man, a common thief caught red-handed with a diamond bracelet. The local news blogs were already churning out the story. Vagrant arrested at the Gilded Lotus. It looked like a total defeat, a final crushing blow to a man who had already lost everything. Back at the club, Julian retreated into the warmth of the VIP lounge, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch. He popped a bottle of vintage champagne, the cork flying into the air as he toasted to his own brilliance. He sat on a plush velvet sofa, regaling Tiffany and their circle with a dramatized version of the arrest, mocking the way Kenji had looked in the rain. He felt invincible, convinced that he had not only protected his club but had finally erased the last lingering ghost of the tailor shop that once stood on this ground. He had no idea that the very foundations of his building were shifting beneath his feet. Inside the holding cell at the precinct, the atmosphere was stark and antiseptic. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing buzz, reflecting off the stainless steel bench. Kenji sat perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't look like a man in distress, he looked like a man waiting for a flight. Officer Miller entered the room, dropping a plastic bag containing Kenji's cracked phone onto the table. Miller looked troubled, his eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner. He told Kenji that something didn't feel right about the statement Tiffany Reed had given. Kenji looked up, his expression unreadable, and told the officer to check the cloud-synced files on the device. While Julian was busy celebrating his victory, Kenji's mind was moving through a complex series of moves like a grandmaster at a chessboard. The arrest wasn't a setback, it was the final piece of leverage. By allowing himself to be taken in, he had forced the Vanes to commit a legal felony, filing a false police report and evidence tampering. Furthermore, the delay in the holding cell gave his legal team the window they needed. His phone buzzed with a notification from Sarah. The Vane Group had officially defaulted on their high-interest mezzanine loans. The hostile takeover wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a completed transaction. Kenji had moved from the position of a victim to the position of an absolute architect of their ruin. The shift in Kenji's mindset was profound. He stopped being the quiet man in the hoodie and began to inhabit the skin of the CEO who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing. He didn't feel anger toward Julian anymore. He felt the cold, detached pity a person feels for an ant that is about to be stepped on. He told Officer Miller that he wouldn't be needing a lawyer because the district attorney would be calling the precinct within the next 10 minutes. He explained, with a chillingly calm voice, that Tiffany Reed's bracelet was registered to a jewelry insurance firm that his own company had acquired 3 months ago, and he had the GPS tracking logs to prove exactly when and where it had been planted. Suddenly, the heavy steel door to the processing room swung open. The precinct captain rushed in, his face a pale mask of panic. He was holding a desk phone with a cord stretched to its limit, whispering that the police commissioner was on the line and was demanding the immediate release of a high-value asset. Miller looked from his captain to the man sitting on the bench. Kenji stood up, the movement fluid and commanding. He didn't wait for them to apologize. He simply told the captain that he wanted a clean suit delivered to his hotel and a car waiting outside. As he walked out of the precinct, the rain had slowed to a light mist. Sarah was waiting by the curb, holding a black umbrella over an open door of a luxury sedan. She handed him a tablet that showed the current stock prices of the Vane Group. They were in a freefall, plummeting toward zero as the news of the takeover hit the wires. Kenji looked back at the gray stone walls of the police station. He told Sarah that he wanted the gala to proceed exactly as planned. He wanted the music to be loud and the champagne to be cold. He wanted the Vanes to feel like they were at the top of the world right until the moment he pulled the sky down on top of them. The long game was over, and the hunt had officially begun. The penthouse suite of the St. Regis was a cathedral of glass and silent efficiency, a world away from the rain-slicked gutters of the previous night. Kenji stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the morning fog roll over the bay, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. He was no longer the man in the damp hoodie. He was draped in a charcoal silk robe, a cup of bitter black coffee in his hand. The transformation had already begun, but it wasn't just about the clothes or the scenery. It was about the cold, surgical precision of the trap he was arming. On the marble kitchen island, Sarah had laid out several thin, encrypted tablets. She moved with the quiet grace of a shadow, reporting that the wire transfers had cleared the Federal Clearinghouse at 4 a.m. The Vane Group was no longer a dynasty, it was a hollowed-out shell, and Kenji Sato held the only match. Across town, at the Gilded Lotus, Julian Vane was basking in the glow of a false sunrise. He strutted through the empty club, his heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floors that he still believed he owned. He was barking orders at the cleaning crew, snapping his fingers at a busboy who wasn't moving fast enough to clear the champagne flutes from the night before. Julian was on top of the world, his phone buzzing with congratulatory texts for taking out the trash. He spent the morning finalizing the guest list for the club's anniversary gala, meticulously deleting anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of elite. He even laughed aloud while instructed his assistant, Brad, to double the security at the door, specifically telling him to watch out for homeless opportunists looking for a handout. To Julian, Kenji was a footnote, a small bug he had crushed under his heel, and the thought made him feel more powerful than ever. Meanwhile, Kenji's process was slow, deliberate, and devastating. He spent the afternoon in a nondescript warehouse in the industrial district, far from the prying eyes of the paparazzi. Gathered there was the true heart of the Gilded Lotus, the dishwashers, the line cooks, and the janitorial staff. These were the people Julian ignored, the ones he underpaid and treated like background noise. Kenji stood before them, not as a billionaire, but as a man who remembered what it felt like to have his father's sewing machine tossed into the mud. He spoke to them in a voice that was low and thick with genuine respect, promising them that by the time the sun rose tomorrow, their back wages would be paid in full, and the man who had insulted their dignity would be the one looking for a job. He wasn't just buying a club, he was reclaiming a community. Back at the club's administrative offices, Brad was hunched over a heavy-duty shredder, the mechanical whine filling the room. He was feeding stacks of paper into the blades, internal memos that proved Julian had been systematically rejecting job applicants based on their last names and zip codes. Brad felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. He knew what he was doing was illegal, but Julian had promised him a promotion for cleaning the files. What Brad didn't know was that the shredder was a decoy. Every document that passed through the scanner in the tray above was being uploaded in real time to a secure server managed by Sarah. The trash that Julian thought he was destroying was actually the evidence that would bury him. As the evening approached, the silence in Kenji's hotel suite was broken only by the soft chime of a final confirmation. Every lawyer had been briefed, every deed had been recorded, and every silent ally had been placed. Kenji looked at a framed photograph of his father, the one he carried in his messenger bag for 15 years. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, the fabric feeling like armor. He told Sarah that it was time to move. He didn't want a grand entrance with sirens or fanfare. He wanted to walk into that club exactly as he had the night before, unnoticed and underestimated. He wanted to see the exact moment the realization hit Julian's eyes that the man he had called a gutter rat was actually the landlord of his entire life. The grind was over, the trap was set, and the gala was about to begin. The air inside the Gilded Lotus was thick with the scent of lilies and the expensive ozone of high-end air filtration. It was the night of the anniversary gala, and the club had been transformed into a shimmering cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the deep, rhythmic pulse of a cello remix, and the guest list read like a who's who of San Francisco's old money and new tech titans. Julian Vane moved through the crowd like a shark in a silk suit, his teeth flashing in a perpetual, artificial smile. He was in his element, holding a glass of vintage crystal and nodding to the flashbulbs of the society photographers. Behind him, Tiffany Reed preened in a backless sequined gown, her diamond bracelet, the very one she had used to frame a man just 48 hours ago, sparkling under the spotlights. She was regaling a circle of venture capitalists with a dramatized version of the vagrant encounter, her voice rising in a shrill, entitled mock horror as she described the danger she had felt. Near the entrance, Julian's father, Arthur Vane, stood with a tight, gray expression that didn't match the festive atmosphere. He was checking his watch every 30 seconds, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a leather folder. He had been trying to reach his board of directors all afternoon, only to find his calls diverted to a voicemail system he didn't recognize. He pulled Julian aside, whispering harshly about a hostile takeover and a mysterious entity called Sato Holdings that was systematically buying up their debt. Julian merely laughed, patting his father's shoulder with a condescending arrogance. He told his father to relax, to enjoy the scotch, and reminded him that they were the Vanes. Nobody could touch them in this city. The heavy oak doors at the front of the club swung open, and the music seemed to dip for a fraction of a second. A sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce had pulled up to the curb, but the man who stepped out wasn't wearing a tuxedo. Kenji Sato walked toward the velvet rope wearing the exact same oversized, damp-looking gray hoodie he had worn the night he was arrested. He had a long, heavy wool coat draped over his shoulders, hiding the sharp lines of the bespoke suit underneath. As he approached the podium, the security guards moved to intercept him, their hands on their belts. Julian spotted him from across the room and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He set his glass down on a passing server's tray with a clatter and marched toward the entrance, his heels snapping against the floor like gunshots. Julian didn't wait for Kenji to speak. He signaled the DJ to cut the music, and the sudden silence was deafening, filled only by the confused murmurs of 500 wealthy guests. Julian stood in the center of the foyer, pointing a trembling finger at Kenji. He shouted for everyone to look at the gutter rat, who had returned for a second helping of jail time. He mocked Kenji's hoodie, calling it a biological hazard, and asked the crowd if they could believe the audacity of a thief trying to walk back into the scene of his crime. Tiffany joined him, her voice dripping with a poisonous sneer as she asked the security guards why the trash hadn't been picked up yet. In the midst of the verbal assault, Sarah entered from the side door. She wasn't hiding in a car tonight. She was dressed in a sharp, professional blazer, carrying a brushed aluminum briefcase that looked like it contained the secrets of a nation. She walked straight to Kenji's side, standing with a posture that was both protective and subservient. Julian glanced at her, confused for a heartbeat, before dismissing her as just another public defender, or bottom feeder, Kenji had managed to scrounge up. He told them both that he was calling the police again, and this time, he'd make sure the handcuffs didn't come off for a decade. He was screaming now, his face turning a blotchy, panicked red, completely unaware that his father had gone totally silent behind him. Arthur Vane was staring at Kenji's face, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific recognition. The room felt like a pressure cooker about to blow, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of a coming storm that Julian was too arrogant to see. Kenji just stood there, his expression as calm as a deep ocean, watching Julian destroy himself one word at a time. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the lungs of every socialite and titan in the building. Julian Vane stood center stage, his mouth hanging open as he prepared to launch into another insult, but the words died in his throat. Arthur Vane, his father, finally broke the paralysis, stumbling forward with his face a sickly shade of ash. He reached out a trembling hand as if to touch Kenji's sleeve, whispering a name from a nightmare he thought he had buried 15 years ago. But Kenji didn't look at Arthur. He looked directly at Julian, and then he let the heavy wool coat slide off his shoulders. Underneath, he wasn't wearing the rags of a vagrant. He was wearing a three-piece suit of such exquisite, hand-stitched quality that it made Julian's designer tuxedo look like a department store clearance item. On the inner lining of the jacket, visible for a brief second, was a small, embroidered gold needle, his father's old tailor mark. Kenji stepped toward the microphone at the center of the lounge, his movements fluid and radiating a terrifying, quiet authority. He didn't scream. He didn't have to. His voice, now deep and commanding, cut through the air like a blade. He told the room that Julian was absolutely right about one thing. The trash did need to be picked up. Kenji signaled to Sarah, who stepped forward and opened her briefcase. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she activated the club's massive internal projection screens. The music was replaced by the crystal-clear audio of Julian's racist tirade from 2 nights ago, followed by a high-definition slow-motion loop of Tiffany Reed's hand sliding her diamond bracelet into Kenji's pocket. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave. Tiffany's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting around the room as she saw her social standing dissolve in real time. Kenji reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of parchment, the original deed to his father's shop. He told Julian that this land didn't belong to the Vane Group anymore. He explained that while Julian was busy popping champagne and mocking those he deemed beneath him, Sato Holdings had systematically acquired every cent of the Vane's defaulted debt. He looked Julian dead in the eye and told him that as of 6 o'clock that evening, the Vane Group was a memory. The building, the club, the liquor in the glasses, and even the very chair Julian's father was currently collapsing into, now belonged to the man they had tried to throw in a cage. The color drained from Julian's face so completely it looked like he might faint. He tried to stammer a response, a desperate, pathetic attempt to claim it was all a misunderstanding, a joke that went too far. He even tried to force a laugh, looking to his guests for support, but everyone had already moved away from him as if he were radioactive. Kenji didn't give him an inch of air. He produced the legal eviction notice for the entire Vane family, a poetic mirror of the one his father had received years ago. He told Julian that justice wasn't just about taking back what was stolen. It was about showing the world the true value of the people Julian had stepped on to get to the top. With a snap of Kenji's fingers, the double doors to the kitchen swung open. The entire back-of-house staff, the dishwashers, the prep cooks, the janitors, walked out into the pristine VIP lounge. They stood in a line behind Kenji, their faces etched with a quiet, triumphant dignity. Kenji announced to the stunned crowd that the Gilded Lotus was dead. Tomorrow, the sign would come down, and in its place, Sato's legacy would open. A space where character was the only membership requirement. He turned to the security team, the same men who had been ready to beat him moments ago, and gave them a simple order. He told them to escort the former manager and his accomplices out of his building. As the officers from the precinct entered the club to take Julian and Tiffany into custody for fraud and evidence tampering, Kenji stood tall, a king reclaiming a kingdom built on the ruins of a tailor shop. The gutter rat had finished his work, and the Vane dynasty vanished into the night air like smoke. The golden neon sign of the Gilded Lotus flickered one last time before dying out, leaving the street in a peaceful, natural darkness. As Julian Vane was led away in handcuffs, his expensive silk tie askew and his face stained with the salt of panicked tears, the world seemed to take a collective breath of relief. Tiffany Reed followed close behind him, hiding her face from the very cameras she had once craved, her designer heels clicking a frantic, hollow rhythm against the pavement as the police doors slammed shut. The empire built on arrogance had vanished in a single night, leaving nothing behind but the cold San Francisco air and the quiet, steady presence of the man they had tried to break. Kenji stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights of the patrol car fade into the city fog, but he didn't feel the surge of spiteful joy he thought he would. Instead, he felt a profound, heavy sense of completion. The following morning, Kenji drove to a quiet, grassy hillside overlooking the bay, far from the noise of the skyscrapers and the gossip of the socialites. He walked through the dew-covered grass until he reached a simple granite headstone. He knelt down, the fabric of his suit brushing against the earth, and placed a small, laminated document on the stone. It was a paid in full notice for the property taxes and the original deed to the tailor shop. He sat there for a long time, the wind rustling the nearby cypress trees, and whispered to his father that the land was finally back in the family. He told him that the sewing machine would never be thrown into the mud again. He was joined shortly by Hannah, who looked vibrant and healthy, her eyes bright with a future that was no longer clouded by the shadow of debt. They stood together, two survivors of a storm that had lasted 15 years, realizing that the greatest revenge wasn't the money they had made, but the people they had become. 5 years passed with the speed of a summer breeze. The corner where the club once stood had been transformed into a bustling, warm community hub known as Sato's Legacy. It wasn't just a restaurant or lounge, it was a sanctuary. The glass walls were gone, replaced by large, welcoming windows that invited the sunlight in. One rainy Tuesday evening, a young man walked through the front doors. He was soaking wet, wearing a generic fast food uniform, and looking down at his scuffed shoes with a sense of deep, visible shame. He hesitated at the host stand, looking as if he expected to be shouted at or told to leave. The staff didn't roll their eyes or check their watches. Instead, a waitress smiled warmly and guided him toward a comfortable booth near the hearth. Kenji, now older with a few streaks of silver at his temples, stepped out from the back office. He didn't see a vagrant or a delivery boy, he saw a reflection of his own past. He walked over to the young man's table, carrying a warm towel and a hot cup of tea. He didn't ask for a credit card or a VIP reservation. He simply sat down across from the boy and told him that the first meal was on the house. In that moment, the cycle of cruelty was officially broken. Kenji understood then that true power isn't measured by how many people you can keep out of a room, but by how many people you can bring in from the cold. The lesson was written in every corner of the building. Character is the only currency that never devalues, and kindness is the only investment that always returns a profit. As the rain continued to fall outside, the lights of Sato's Legacy burned bright and steady, a beacon for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong.